Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Pai's Astrology channel. This is Nav, and today we are here with Kṣaṇāti with our series of Rahu Ketu transit in September. So this is our part 2, which is going to be with each ascendant. So we're going to cover from Aries to Virgo in our part 2 series. Welcome, Kṣaṇāti.
Oh, namaste, Navjeet. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here with you again and discuss this very exciting topic. This is our second part. In the first part, we discussed how it will be affecting, on the general, on the society, the virus, politics. It got a little controversial, and now in a fun way. And now as we get into the second part, we're going to be talking how it's going to be affecting each Lugnesh, how it's going to be affecting each ascendancy. And just to summarize for everyone out there, this transit begins on September 23rd, okay? And it lasts until 2022. So you're looking at a transit that is almost 2 years long. So it's going to last well into 2022. And so that means buckle your seatbelts because we're about to get on a roller coaster because Rahu's about to get exalted and Ketu's about to get exalted. So let's talk about how that's going to impact us and each of our charts. And so we'll start with Aries Ascendant in this first video, and we'll get through Virgo. And in the second part, we'll go Libra through Pisces. But everyone will get their ascendant addressed in this series by Nav and I. And we're very much excited to deliver this information and share this information with you and hope that it will benefit you during this transit. And maybe if I can, I'll offer some remedial techniques that might be helpful for the Rahu Ketu transit that are impacting the various charts. But since we are discussing this huge transit of Rahu and Ketu, let's do a quick chanting to Rahu and Ketu, first Ganesh, and then Rahu and Ketu, and it will really open up the energies to come through. Om Gananam Dva Ganapatim Havamahe Kavim Kavinam Upamastravastamam Jaistarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatanaha Shrinbanu Tibihi Siddhasadanam Vakratanda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakayeshu Sarvada Siddhi Buddhi Shakti Sahita Shriman Mahaganati Pataye Namo Namaha Nirvignam Kuru. Om Ardakayam Mahaviryam Chandradijya Vimardinam Simhita Garbha Sambutam Tamrahu Pranamamyaham. Ardakayam Mahaviryam Chandradijya Vimardamanam Simhita Garbha Sambutam Tamrahu Pranamamyaham. Ardakayam Mahaviryam Chandradijya Vimardanam Simhita Garbha Sambutam Tamrahu Pranamamyaham. Om Bram Brim Bram Saharahuve Namaha. Om Bram Brim Bram Saharahuve Namaha. Om Bram Brim Bram Saharahuve Namaha. Om Brahm Brim Brahm Saharahuve Namaha. Om Palas Puspa Sankasham Takara Grahamastakam Radram Rajatvikam Goram Tam Ketu Pranamam Yaham. Palas Puspa Sankasham Takara Grahamastakam Radram Rajatvikam Goram Tam Ketu Pranamam Yaham. Palas Puspa Sankasham Takara Grahamastakam Radram Rajatvikam Goram Tam Ketu Pranamam Yaham. Om Kram Krim Kram Saha Kitave Namaha. Om Kram Krim Kram Saha Kitave Namaha. Om Kram Krim Kram Sa Kitave Namaha. Om Kram Krim Kram Sa Kitave Namaha. Hari Om Namah Shivaya. Namaste, Navjeet, and all of our beloved followers.
Namaste, Kṣaṇāti. That's beautiful.
And for all of you who'd like the description and the translation, just jump back to the first part of our video where we'd go over the translation of those mantras, if you're really interested in that. But first, let's dive right into this transit. And again, we're talking about it being really strong on September 23rd when the transit starts to really take place. And that lasts for a couple years. So these energies that we're going to be talking about, they're not these energies that come and go quickly. Like Saturn, Rahu and Ketu moves extremely slow. And there's some other facts that are important to learn about Rahu and Ketu as well, is they're permanently retrograde planets. So currently Rahu is in the position of Gemini, and Ketu is in the position of Sagittarius. But because of their retrograde nature, instead of moving into Cancer and into Leo, they are moving into Taurus, and they are moving into Scorpio, because that is the retrograde motion of the lunar node. So if you're wondering why they are moving backwards in a sign versus forwards in a sign, it's because of their retrograde motion. Now, when you take a look at the Aries transit, if you're an Aries lugna, an Aries ascendant, and how this transit will be affecting you, well, first we know that your chart is ruled by Mars.
Right.
And that Mars is enemies with Rahu, but friends with Ketu. And Rahu is going to be in Venus's sign, which Mars is also enemies with Venus.
Okay.
But Ketu will be in Mars sign, so Mars will be having a much better, Ketu will be having a much better impact for the Aries ascendant than the Rahu will be having.
Okay.
Something interesting also to note for the Aries ascendant is that during that time that Rahu and Ketu transit into Taurus and Scorpio, Mars will also be going retrograde. You know, in and out of Pisces, which is its current position. So we can understand this as that being even more intense, some of these energies of the Mars influence even being more intense, especially when we look at Ketu's position. But first we'll take a look at Rahu's position and see Rahu falls into the second house.
Right.
And the second house is the house of wealth. And an exalted Rahu does very good for wealth. And so there's a lot of potential, especially if Mars has a good placement in the natal chart. Mars has a good placement in the D9 of the native. But Mars will be retrograde in its friend sign, so the retrograde nature will make it difficult. But Pisces and Mars go together pretty well, and I'm having my Mars return as being a Mars Piscean myself.
Okay.
But the effect of Rahu on the second house does indicate a lot of opportunities for financial gain and financial wealth for the Aries ascendant during this time. But as we know with Rahu, it's ahead, And it has to do with Maya, and it's foggy and it's smoky, and so it's hard to really see the future.
Right.
So even though it indicates that over, let's say you're an Aries ascendant, this could be a materially beneficial period for you based on Rahu's position, exaltation position in the second house of wealth, Artabhava. So
Right.
it's possible that your savings account could increase. But Rahu will make it so you're not exactly sure how or when or why. So we have to surrender to that aspect. And that's when we look a little bit more at the Ketu. And then Ketu is in the house of expenses and in that eighth house.
Right.
And that eighth house position of Ketu is extremely powerful in its exalted form. And that's the house of expenses. But remember, Ketu can represent loss.
Right.
So we think of the loss of expenses, and
Right.
expenses are something that you want to lose. The more expenses you have, the more money that you have to spend. So if you lose expenses, that's a good thing.
Yeah. Interesting.
So on the material side of this transit for the Aries ascendant, it could be potentially very beneficial. But on the spiritual side for the Aries ascendant, this could be more of a difficult transit, because at first Mars will be in the 12th house retrograde. If you're an Aries ascendant, Mars will be transiting your 12th house because Pisces is in 12th house.
Right.
So that already activates moksha vibration. And then the activation of Ketu in its exaltation position in the 8th house heavily activates moksha vibration.
Right.
So, and we know that Mars has to do with the health, the vitality, and the strength of the individual. And the 8th house, 12th houses have to do with health vulnerabilities.
Right.
So this is a great opportunity for financial gain, but health risks might be involved.
Mm.
And, we see that right now with people going out there and getting jobs in the middle of this coronavirus.
Right.
And if the coronavirus is still here in September, people will just be wanting to work more because people are just going to be running out of money and the stimulus checks will stop. And so there will be this need to get a job no matter what situation of the virus is.
Right.
And so that eighth house of moksha being heavily activated does show that I think that there's a vulnerability of death during this time for the Aries ascendant, and to have death in their life. That means if they have elder members of their family
Right.
who are getting sick, or who are already sick, or have pre-existing conditions, or are maybe getting to an age where they are starting to begin their transition, then this transit will activate that transition.
Okay.
And that activation of that transition will cause a lot of experience, not necessarily the individual themselves dying, but the witnessing and the observing of death to get us closer to moksha, to get us closer to spiritual liberation. Because even though we all want moksha and we all want to become enlightened, one of the closest ways to get there is to experience death, is to witness death, is to observe what we call death, and to see it as a beautiful thing. Not to see it necessarily as the biggest loss in the world, but rather the person's suffering is gone and they had transitioned from this realm to Svarga, the celestial dimension. And that's a beautiful thing. And if we can learn to, maybe the Aries ascendant experiences death during this time, work with that idea of reincarnation and the reincarnation cycle to really help you work through this process. So again, for the Aries ascendant, we see that duality, a high chance for material success, but also having to deal with death and disease and the encountering of these things. So those are the kind of dualities I see for the Aries ascendant as we transit with the exalted Taurus and Scorpio positions coming up. So I hope that was interesting, Navjeet, before we move on.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you, Kṣaṇāti. So I was asking, second house is also the house of food, right? So
Yeah,
Rahu, what does it like indicate? Like bad
yeah.
food habits, or they should be careful of, you know?
Well, it's exalted, so we have to look at the ruler of that Taurus is Venus. So the individual's Venus in their natal chart will be significant in determining their relationship with food and drugs and alcohol and even intimacy and all of these things. But yes, Rahu being in the house of food here, it encourages indulgence.
Right. And
and
then,
and Rahu sometimes can bring when we indulge, it can bring consequences.
right,
So I think of someone who's been drinking late at night, and then they go to one of those late night food trucks and they get themselves some food, and they end up getting very sick from the food that they got from the food truck.
right,
Something like those kind of scenarios are very active, especially with that Ketu vulnerability in the 8th house, saying, okay, with the material and pleasurable risks that you take, you're taking health risks along with those risks.
right. And besides just seeing the natal positions of Venus and Mars in their chart, it's also the transit, right? Transit will affect you within those 2 years where the Venus and Mars is going
Oh,
in
yeah,
the as well.
exactly, as it moves throughout the chart. But yeah, that Rahu in the 2nd house, it also gives creative ability when it comes to our relationship with food.
Right.
So people might be cooking more.
Yeah.
And during the quarantine, a lot of people have been eating more takeout because they don't want to go to the grocery store.
Right. Yes.
So this might be a time where we feel safer about going to the grocery store so we can be cooking more. And Rahu represents this innovation. So a lot of creative things, they could bring a lot of creativity into cooking. And if you combine the financial aspect with the food aspect, for those of you who work in the food service industry, you've been dealing with a lot of difficulties. A lot of restaurants are going out of business, and it's been hard to keep up. But this time of the Rahu position for the Aries ascendant transiting the 2nd house shows that, okay, if you're a restaurant owner, this will be a time for you to be really successful and kind of bounce back from whatever kind of economic troubles you had recently.
Okay. And the results will be the same for people who don't have Aries ascendant but Aries moon?
If you want to look from a Chandra chart perspective,
Okay.
certainly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Even people who have Sun in Aries, and people, especially people with planets in Taurus, because that Rahu will be directly, hitting their Taurus. So for people, who have Rahu and Ketu in their natal position or having the Rahu Ketu return right now, doesn't matter what ascendant you are, this is going to be one of the most powerful and potentially one of the most successful materially or spiritually expansive times of your life. Now, moving on into the Taurus ascendancy, we look that it falls into the ascendant. The transit falls into the ascendant, and then Ketu goes into the 7th house.
Right.
And so we know that the ruler of the Taurus ascendant is Venus, and Venus is said to be friends with Rahu. And Venus is actually said to be neutral towards Ketu, not an enemy. Although Venus is debilitated in Taurus, so that does, have that energy. But when Rahu goes into the ascendant in its exalted form, and Ketu falls into the 7th house, there are two real strong possibilities, depending on the strength of the Rahu versus the Ketu in the person's chart, which kind of path they will take in their life. If the Rahu is very strong and they're less afflicted than the Ketu, more functionally benefic, this person will be very much focused on themselves during this time, and they'll like to be traveling, and they'll like to be making money, again, focusing on the material aspect of things. They will be having creative ideas, but it is affecting their personality and their identity on one level. So it's also like this soul-seeking, self-searching, who am I? Because if you think about it from the perspective of the Taurus Ascendant is a natural home body energy. It's an energy that likes to stay at home. And I am a Jupiter retrograde in Taurus in the 4th house. So just imagine how strong that is for me. So then you combine that with, okay, you've been in a quarantine for a long period of time, not really being able to go out. And then Rahu comes and enters this position of Taurus. And so it kind of wants you to break free of your comfort zone in terms of, the nesting kind of energy, the stay-at-home energy, the nesting energy there. Rahu will kind of cause you to kind of break outside of your comfort zone, break outside of your bubble, and maybe travel to a new location. But it's all about doing what you need to do for yourself, because you haven't been able to do that for a little while.
Right.
When you look at Ketu's position in the 7th house, there's another path that the individual could take. This period of isolation that we've been in, well, for single people who don't have girl partners or husbands or wives,
right,
this could have been a very lonely time.
Yeah.
And Ketu in its 7th house position represents our past lifetime soulmates coming back into our life.
Right.
And this is an opportunity there's been a lot of isolation and loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
And so this transit of Ketu entering the 7th house could be very beneficial in bringing some romantic soulmate energy into the individual's life that they haven't had for some time.
Right.
But Ketu is also the moksha karaka. So there's a certain level of non-attachment that'll also be brought to that energy.
Right.
Because if you think about it, also, yes, people will be interested in being involved in relationships when they've been lonely and isolated for a long time. But when you look at Rahu, they've also been unemployed.
Right.
So the Taurus Ascendant can't just focus on the relationship. They have to focus on, okay, the financial income as well. But the Ketu energy does want to serve the partner. It does want to prioritize the partner. It does want to put the partner first.
Interesting.
So that's the more spiritual path. Is
Right.
to if you've been lonely and single and feeling that, maybe being open to the possibility of finding your soulmate. Or you can focus on this self-identity, traveling around the world, figuring out who I am, having lots of fun, And, you know, there's not a right or wrong choice there because both are in their exalted position. I guess it really just matters, you know, the transits on those planets in the person's chart, as well as their natal positions of Rahu and Ketu, and Venus and Mars in their chart.
Beautiful.
So that's just a little bit about Taurus. As I move on to Gemini, I'm going to pull up Gemini and Cancer here. As I move on to Gemini, we see that Rahu falls into the 12th house. Remember, because Rahu is a retrograde planet, so it's moving backwards. So it's going to fall into the 12th house. And that means Ketu will fall into the 6th house.
Right.
Now, the Gemini Lagna is ruled by Mercury. Mercury is said to either be neutral or a friend to Rahu, but it's not an enemy.
Okay.
So that benefits. Mercury is an enemy of Ketu.
Right.
And for Gemini, it's a very Lagna. Ketu is can be a very difficult planet.
Okay. So
this transit can be better for Rahu than Ketu. But what's interesting is that Ketu, which is the Mokshakaraka planet, falls into a 6th house, which is an Artabhava house. So moksha energy falling into a financial house.
Right.
And then you have the material energy of Rahu falling into a moksha, 12th house, spiritual house.
Right. So
you really have a flip-flop of energies. And recently, because the Rahu has been in Gemini, the Gemini Ascendant has really been on this path of self-discovery. And as Rahu moves into the 12th house, it's they've had a lot of time to kind of figure out what they want with their lives. And if that's a spiritual path, now is their time to start dedicating themselves towards that. But it's more likely that it's just about experiencing the things that they haven't been able to experience.
Right.
Now, Rahu going into the 12th house does indicate foreign traveling, foreign possible resettlement. And then Ketu's activation in the 6th house could show financial income with that foreign resettlement. So there's a lot of energy there as far as the resettlement. And there will be a transit of Ketu and Mercury right around the same time as the beginning of the transit.
Right.
So it's starting off with that Ketu Mercury energy, which is part of the enemy relationship of the Gemini Lagna. So the beginning of this transit will be harder for the Gemini Lagna than the middle and the end. Now, Rahu in the 12th house, the person may be heavily seeking material gains.
Right.
And we have to look at transits on the 10th house, natal positions on the 10th house to see if those financial gains are possible.
Okay.
But a lot of times, Rahu represents desire, and the 12th house can represent us not getting that which we desire, us losing our desire.
Right.
So in the most spiritual sense, we practice the contentedness,
Right.
or serenity,
right,
peace of mind. And this is someone who, if it has a very good position and no afflictions, they can have a really positive time with this transit. But from a Rahu perspective.
Sure.
And because it's in the house of moksha and Rahu likes to try new things, this period of this transit is the best time for the Gemini Lugna to try new things on their path to spirituality.
Okay.
So, you know, that can mean many different things, but that could mean, you know, if you've been focusing on one deity, focusing your energy towards another deity.
Right.
It could mean if you're focusing on one religion, you switch your focus to another religion.
Right.
Or you start to focus on shamanism or Ayurveda or Jyotish or Vastu or yoga or chanting bhakti yoga. Or
Right.
so there's all of these energies that are kind of pushing you to try new things or do things that are more mystical, occult, or esoteric to help your spiritual elevation or to help your spiritual frequency.
Right.
But the downside is Rahu can sometimes like to take shortcuts.
Yeah.
And when it comes to enlightenment, unfortunately, there's no shortcuts. If there's anything the mythology of the Rahu and Ketu tale tells us, there really are no shortcuts to our enlightenment. We have to achieve it through learning all of the lessons we're here to learn. But that Rahu in the 12th house can tempt the individual to maybe take shortcuts to enlightenment.
Okay.
Because there's no such thing as a shortcut to enlightenment, you're dealing with Maya.
Right.
But if you, this might be a time where people who have this position, they can believe that they've have glimpses of enlightenment or they've become enlightened at times.
Right.
But ultimately, I would disagree with them. And one thing that shows is at the same time that the Rahu will be transiting the 12th house for this person, Saturn in its natural position, Capricorn, will be not retrograde anymore and will be transiting Capricorn, which is in their 8th house.
Okay.
So that combination of energies also kind of indicates this potential for them to, one of the shortcuts they might want to take for spiritual growth is drugs.
Okay.
And you know, there's a lot of energy out there in the universe right now. There are plants in Peru. There's the peyote that the Native Americans use, the ayahuasca they use in Peru, the iboga they use in Africa and Costa Rica. And these plants, when you take these plants, they give you an enlightened experience, but it's temporary. But it's
Right.
possible that the person with this position might confuse that experience as not temporary.
Right.
And they might think that they're taking a shortcut when they're getting a glimpse of something that they have to work to through spiritual sadhana to get to on their own. They're getting a glimpse of it through this ritual.
Right.
They could be drinking the bhanga on Shivaratri.
Right.
But that glimpse, you have to actually have a daily dinacharya and sadhana and extremely strong spiritual practice to get there. So again, the remedy that I have for this position is, okay, you're tempted towards shortcuts with the Rahu in the 12th house there. Try not to take shortcuts towards your enlightenment. Take the long road.
Right.
Now, one of the things that's difficult, as we talked about, Ketu is going to be more difficult for the Gemini Ascendant.
Right.
And Ketu goes into the 6th house.
Yes.
And this is a house of work.
Right.
So it shows that it could be a financially difficult time.
Okay.
It could be a tough time to find job.
Right.
Which is probably why with Rahu in the 12th house, the person has all this time to do all these other things
Right.
Why? Because they might not potentially have job.
Right.
But jobs also come out of the 6th house.
Okay.
But it's not the job you want to have. It's the job you have.
Okay.
So there's kind of, for the Gemini Lugna, they kind of have a choice. Possibly. Depending on their 10th house position, I'm not saying your career will be taken away from you.
Okay.
But you have a choice to either work a job that is not the most fulfilling for your soul, or kind of step away from financial focus for a bit and focus more spiritually. And that might mean traveling to a place where it's very inexpensive to be there, and very inexpensive to live there, and very inexpensive to work there.
Right.
And those are the kind of shortcuts that I would encourage taking during this period. Is, because it's going to be hard to make money during this period unless the person is slaving 50, 60 hours a week upon their job.
Wow.
And a lot of people, are still going to be afraid of the virus and things like that.
Right.
So we have to take that into effect and say, okay, well, this isn't the most financially beneficial period for the Gemini Lugna. It kind of pushes them more towards traveling and experiencing life and letting go of their attachment to money, and maybe letting go of the attachment to their career, and letting go of the attachment to the financial focus on the life.
Right. Yeah.
So I hope that was interesting. Should we discuss anything before I move on to Cancer?
No, I'm good. We can move on to Cancer.
Okay. Well, when we're looking at the Cancer ascendancy, it's very, very interesting because Rahu falls into the 11th house and Ketu falls into the 5th house.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
Now, both when we talk about Cancer and Leo, those are difficult ascendants when it comes to Rahu and Ketu for the most part, unless, of course, the person has a natal exalted, also Rahu, Taurus, Ketu, Scorpio, definitely an exception.
Okay.
But we know that Cancer is ruled by the moon.
Right.
Both Rahu and Ketu are great enemies towards the moon.
Right.
So the moon's position in each individual's natal chart is very significant for the Cancer ascendancy. So a highly dignified moon can do very well during this period, as far as its potential to be happy. But poorly positioned moon can struggle with sadness and depression and other mental afflictions when Ketu and Rahu are so heavily and intense in the chart.
Right.
So with Rahu's falling into the 11th house for the individual, this is a good position for Rahu, even though the Cancer is not good relationship with Rahu. The 11th house is a good position for Rahu.
Right.
And when Rahu is exalted in the 11th house, it gives lots of surprise gains, lots of surprise profits.
Right.
And the 11th house is also the house of allies or friends.
Okay.
And Rahu can represent foreign or exotic friends.
Okay.
So for the Cancer ascendant, they could be making many new friends. Different races, different genders, different religion. All the more diversity of their friend, the better.
Right.
And we are just coming away from a civil rights movement. And we're still fighting the civil rights movement in America very hard right now.
Right.
And it shows that having diversity is a key part of non-racism.
Right.
You know, if you know, we must all, if we are all think of ourselves as one, then we have to have friends of all different races, all different religions. We don't want to limit ourselves to our friendship by any of these things.
Right.
And
I
I think
agree.
that's very powerful for the Cancer Lugna, who is sympathetic, empathetic, and caring.
Right.
And so they're opening up their chance to make new friends.
Right. And maybe getting more socializing more.
Exactly. A lot more social energy is being activated here. Um, Also in the 11th house, I call it the house of dream achievement, where
Right.
because the 12th house is when all your dreams have already been achieved. So the 11th house is whatever dreams are left over that you have to achieve so you can get to the 12th house of moksha.
Right.
So Rahu, being this strong lust craving planet of desire, shows this is a real time period for those individuals to try to, not necessarily for them to try to, but to see that their dreams can be accomplished.
Right.
And before, Rahu was in the 12th house for the Cancer Ascendant. That makes it very much harder for any dreams to be accomplished.
Right.
But now Rahu's moving into the 11th house for the Cancer Ascendant, where their dreams can be accomplished.
Right. So
So
it's a
I think this, what's that, Navji?
much better energy for them
Yes,
from the 12th to 11th. Right.
especially with Rahu.
Right.
But when I take a look at Ketu's position, the thing is, you know, Venus and Moon, you know, Rahu and Taurus, Taurus is ruled by Venus. Venus and Moon aren't, you know, aren't the closest friendly planets, but they're not these great enemies.
Right.
But sometimes the position that Ketu is exalted in is the position that the Moon is debilitated in.
Okay.
And the Cancer Ascendant is ruled by the Moon.
Right.
So it can be a very difficult transit of Ketu for the Cancer Ascendant.
Okay.
And the Cancer falls into the the Ketu falls into the 5th house. Now we
Right.
know the 5th house represents education. So for the Cancer Ascendant, and Rahu also aspecting that house, and Mars will be in the beginning going through that transit in the 9th house, which
Right.
is the house of higher education. This person could be heavily desiring to become more educated.
Okay.
Maybe they're a high school student who wants to go to college.
Right.
Maybe they're a college student who graduated who now wants to go to graduate school.
Right.
Many schools are not opening. California just announced yesterday they're doing their first semester of schools for all schools in California on the internet.
Oh, okay. So it's all going online
Yeah,
for
for
now.
California.
Okay.
And the other states in the United States may follow,
Interesting.
especially the liberal ones. So as you look more into this energy, it is going to be a very poor time of bad time for education,
Hmm.
because teachers are not going to want to be in schools. Students are not going to want to be in schools. And online learning does not compare to actual in-school learning.
Right.
I went to a school that was partially online classes, and I learned 5 times more from my actual classes than anything I ever learned from my online classes.
Right. Yes.
You know, that's why when I teach Jyotish, I never do pre-recorded classes like many teachers teach. I always teach one-on-one, live, direct.
Right.
You know, because that's the best way to really allow someone to meet them where they are in terms of their education, because everyone's knowledge and brain works in a different way. So how can you teach in a general way? You must teach in a specific way. That's why I think the smaller the school, the better. The larger the school, the less individualized attention towards the student. I'm a big believer in education.
Absolutely. I agree.
This is a difficult period, though, for the Cancer ascendant who wants to seek education during this time. It's not the best time.
Right.
And then this is also the house of children.
Yeah.
So when you talk about desires and karma, a lot of times, if you're a man, you desire to be a father. And if you're a woman, you desire to be a mother.
Right.
And there are so many exceptions to that. And one of the things this transit might show is that for the Cancer ascendant, even though they have a very motherly energy, which is innate inside of them, that this isn't a time that they want to become a biological mother.
Right.
And it is a dangerous time to be pregnant and a dangerous time to bring a small baby into the world right now. More dangerous than other times.
Right. Yes.
So it's also not a good time for pregnancy for the Cancer ascendancy.
Okay.
And for the children that they already have, the Cancer ascendant is very attached to their children.
Right.
They're very love their children. They don't want their children to leave the home. They don't
Yeah.
want their children to leave mom or dad. They want their children close by. But
Yes.
if their children is of adult age, they've just been quarantined for a certain period of time, and they're going to want to get out of their mom and dad's house.
Right.
So one thing you see also that's a difficult transit for the Cancer ascendant is the children of people who are Cancer ascendant during this period. Their children will be creating some distance from their parents.
Okay.
And that's just because of the circumstances and the chart, of course. And you have to look at their 4th house, and you have to look at their 5th house natally and transits on these 2 areas to truly understand if they're going to leave home or not during this period. But there's a lot of indications for the Cancer ascendant of leaving home during this period.
Okay.
So that's very interesting. And also, this is a house of spiritual techniques, and it's our house of where the strongest amount of our past lifetime karmic energy comes in.
Right.
So Ketu rep being a past lifetime planet, being in a past lifetime house, this can be a strong period where a lot of past lifetime karma comes into the life of the Cancer ascendant.
Right.
And maybe that karma is between you and your children.
Right.
If your moon is in the 5th house, maybe the karma is between you and your husband if your moon is in the 7th house. Maybe there's a karma is between you and your family if the moon is in the 4th house. So we have to take a look at that. But in general, yeah, there's going to be that kind of vibration coming through from the 5th house position of Ketu and Scorpio for the Cancer ascendant. And there will be a healthy amount of distance created between parents and their children during that time for the Cancer ascendant. But for the Cancer ascendant parent, they experience a missing, a longing, a sadness, as that child creates that separation, even though it's healthy.
Right.
But if they have a well-positioned moon, then they have the emotional maturity to be able to flow with this process.
Right.
Wonderful. So shall we move on to Leo?
Yes, please.
Okay, wonderful. So as we take a look at the Leo transit, we see that Rahu falls into the 10th house and Ketu falls into the 4th house.
Right.
These are very strong positions for Rahu and Ketu. First, because they're the north and south Kendra.
Right.
So they run along the Kundalini axis. And now you have Rahu and Ketu running along your Kundalini axis. So get ready for all of the spiritual energy inside of yourself to become much more active.
Right.
But again, we see two different paths that people can take depending on which planet is stronger in their chart, the Rahu or the Ketu. Which planet is more benefic or beneficial in the chart, the Rahu or Ketu? Which planet is less afflicted? Which transits on those planets are more beneficial versus more difficult? But one of the things that will be difficult during this time is for the Leo ascendant, Saturn will be in the 6th house and Mars will be in the 8th house when this transit first comes around.
Right.
So both those houses being activated can bring a lot of challenges. And then we know that the Leo ascendant is ruled by the sun.
Right.
And both Rahu and Ketu are great enemies with the sun.
Right.
The sun and moon are Rahu and Ketu's greatest enemies. So I think it's almost like a fight over who's more powerful.
Right.
Because the sun and moon are said to be the most powerful, but sometimes it seems like Rahu and Ketu are more powerful.
Right.
So there's always this war.
Yeah.
Rahu says it's more powerful, Ketu says it's more powerful, and the sun and moon say, no, we're more powerful. So that's how I see the fight. Now, the two different paths that I see the Leo transit, now the Leo represents leadership, and there'll be a transit of Venus in Leo during this time when the transit first happens. So that will be very beneficial for the individual, especially if they have a well-placed natal Venus, and Venus has, their Leo has some positive transits on it.
Right.
But it indicates, because Rahu is exalted in the 10th house, the greatest time in the individual's life for not only financial success, but career growth, career expansion, recognition, fame, power, success. For the Leo ascendant, hopefully they're humble. I always prefer a humble Leo ascendant versus an egotistical one.
Right.
And they can try to hide their egos, but not from me. But there is this energy of that ego can be fueled by the exalted Rahu in the 10th house.
Right.
And this can be a time where the person wants to become famous and they want to become powerful. And so they're pushing to become more famous and they're pushing to become more powerful. You can see all of that energy really coming through strong. And so it's a good opportunity to try new things when it comes to your career.
Right.
Because when Rahu is in the 10th house, there can be a lot of uncertainty. or job changes within the idea of career. But this is the time. Whichever career path you choose, you have the highest potential of success with it,
Right.
especially if other planets and transits are well positioned here in natal chart and the transit.
Right.
So again, that's one path the individual could take, is that real fame, power, success, leadership path. And so even though the it's not a functional benefic Rahu for the Leo ascendant because of its rulership of the sun, you have to look at the position of the sun. And so a person with an exalted sun, they could be very egotistical and power hungry during this time. But when this transit first starts, it'll be very close to sun going into its debilitation in Libra,
Okay. Right.
which can represent a time of humility.
Right.
So maybe ideally, I'd like to hope the people that are becoming more popular and more famous are the better people, are the good people, and it's not the people who are egotistical and hungry. But again, there is this energy of, if you want success and power during this time, then that exalted Rahu in the 10th house will help you get it.
Right.
Now, looking at Ketu falling into the 4th house is a moksha house. It's also a house of home. It's a house of family. It's a house of property.
Right.
So there can be lots of changes in terms of the home life during this period. And for the Leo Lugna, this can be a very difficult position of Ketu in the 4th house. Because first of all, it can kind of show that you're potentially taken away from your home or your homeland.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of potential actually during this time for the Leo Lugna to be more successful as long as they're willing to travel and go different places, but less successful if they stay stuck and are unwilling to travel and will only stay in one place.
Right.
And that K2 in the 4th house can represent our non-attachment towards things.
Right.
So we become, if we are on a more spiritual path, our K2 is stronger in our chart. Maybe we become less attached to our home, less attached to our cars. Maybe we become less attached to the land that we're from or we're living in for various conditions.
Right.
You know, because maybe it's overconsumed by coronavirus or it's having economic difficulties because of that. So we have to make a transition or change for our success.
Right.
So it's also two different paths. One, focusing more on, like traveling around the world and seeing the world and getting rid of your material attachments.
Mm-hmm.
But with Rahu exalted in the 10th house, it shows the opposite. It just wants the power and the fame and the ego and the success and the glory and the applause.
Right.
But for those on the spiritual path, they remain humble during this period.
Right.
And they let go of their material attachments and they let go of their material desires. And also, again, we talked earlier about this concept of breaking free of the home. Well, with
Right.
K2 being in the 4th house, it's going to be very tough for this individual, the Leo Lugna, to stay in one place during the whole transit.
Right.
They'll be most satisfied by traveling to as many places as possible, and the possibility of resettlement giving them a job opportunity that could be very beneficial for them.
Right. So like fourth house is also the house of mother, right?
Yes.
So yeah, so just Ketu transiting in the fourth house, does it show anything about mother's health or like the
So,
type of,
yeah, I always get, sad talking about this stuff sometimes. So that's maybe
right,
why I don't always mention it at first. But if your mother is elderly, the K2 fourth house is the first moksha house in the chart, and the fourth house is the house of the mother.
right,
So Nav is 100% absolutely right in her prediction that it is a time where the mother's health will decline.
right,
And if she is getting closer to death, it could bring her to her transition.
right. Or could come up with health issues, right? Even though if
Of
there's
course,
nothing,
of course. It
right,
doesn't guarantee death,
right,
but it could bring up a health issue if it wasn't treated, could lead to that,
right, right.
you
Yeah,
know, like an
yeah,
untreated coronavirus.
right,
You have to have that treated to heal from that, and well, not if you're young, but if you're old,
right,
and most of our mothers are older than we are, at least by a generation.
right. Yes,
Um, but yeah, for people who have mothers right now in their 80s and 90s, and those kind of ages, um, it's important for you to understand that for the Leo Lugnas especially, I mean, for them to understand that those members of their family are vulnerable during this time,
right,
and so take extra good care of them.
right,
And even though everyone else might be okay with getting the coronavirus because they're young and they can fight it off and they can bounce back strong, it's not the same for the elderly.
right. Thank you.
So yeah, it's definitely, but yeah, the other health problems in addition to the virus can show up. The fourth house is also the house of the heart.
Right,
So we have to worry if our mothers have pre-existing heart conditions. It's you K2 can make their heart very nervous, which will make their heart condition worse.
right,
So like remedy wise, you want to keep your mother very calm. You want to keep her heart very still.
right,
Be a calming force in her life. And hopefully that Rahu in the 10th house, the fact that you're making so much money will bring her some relief as well. I think every mother likes to hear that their child is doing well in that area.
right. Yes, that's true.
Especially with Rahu in the 10th house, they might have chosen a non-traditional career.
Right,
So it's even more important for their family to know that, yes, I've chosen this non-traditional career like astrology, but
right,
I'm able to pay the rent. I'm able to buy the groceries. And
yes,
I'm even taking a little trip somewhere. This will make the mother very happy.
right. That's
So
great.
excellent question. So the last ascendant we're going to discuss is Kanya, Virgo Lugna, and that's ruled by Mercury again. And we talked about Mercury has at least a neutral relationship with Rahu. Some say a friend relationship with Rahu, and others say that Virgos do very well with Rahu energy, and that Rahu does well in Virgo. So it's not really a negative, like for the Gemini ascendant, we didn't like it very much, uh, it, especially with K2. But Rahu does specifically well for the Virgo ascendancy, and K2 doesn't do as bad as it does with the Gemini ascendancy.
Right,
So it's better for Rahu and it's less bad for K2. So that's very positive. So um, you'll see during this time that Rahu goes into the ninth house. Now, the
right,
ninth house is a house of Dharma. and Rahu is exalted and can show Maya, illusion. And this is also a path of spiritual evolution and gurus and spiritual education and spiritual teaching. And Rahu represents the full realization of our mystical or occult potential. So we talked earlier, I think for the Gemini Lagna, it's a very difficult period for education.
Right.
But for the Virgo Lagna, it's a very good period for education. Unfortunately, not traditional education, because Rahu represents that which is outside of the box.
Right.
Especially in its exalted form. So we're not talking about med school. We're not talking about law school. We're not talking about business school, you know, the most common degrees. We're talking about yoga certification. We're talking about astrologer certification, Ayurvedic certification, Chinese herbalism certification, homeopathy certification. We're talking about, you know, marine biology. We're talking about working in space, becoming an astronaut. Like all of the things which are outside of the box are not your typical things that, what's that, dear?
I said it's all the fun stuff.
It's all the fun stuff. And the Virgo Lagna is naturally wants to use their intellect, and now they can actually use it on all this fun stuff.
Right.
And what's also nice about the Ketu is the Ketu goes into the third house, which is a natural house for Mercury. And this is a Mercury ruled chart. And it shows a transformation in how the person communicates and expresses themselves. Right. And so it has a lot of ability for them to, you know, they're learning, they're speaking, they're reading, they're writing, what they focus that on, it gives it a lot of opportunity to change, which helps support that education of those fun, non-traditional, outside of the box things.
Right.
And then also, I really like when Ketu's in the third house, because the third house is upachaya.
Right.
Self-improvement, evolution. And the Virgo Kanya, their dharmic vibration is purification. They always want to make things better. They always want to improve things. So how beneficial will be the transit of Ketu in the third house? Even though from a functional perspective, it's malefic, its third house position kind of corrects that.
Right.
And it says that this is actually a period for you where you can look at yourself in the, see, the Virgo Lagna likes to fix things. And of course, they can be somewhat perfectionist when it comes to their body image and how they look physically and things like that. But they're not necessarily always focused on how to improve themselves as much as they're focused on how to improve others.
Right.
But they are very concerned with their appearance and improving their appearance. That's important. Right. But Ketu's position is causing them to want to improve themselves, and not just physically, but spiritually.
Right.
To let go of their attachments, to be the better person, to explore spirituality, to explore spiritual evolution, to allow yourself to study and learn the things that your soul truly wants to learn versus what your parents are telling you to do.
Right.
So again, we do see again some social distancing, quote unquote, we like to use that now, from our parents, but it's going to be more than 6 feet for a lot of us during this transit of Rahu and Ketu. If you've been with your parents during this transit of Rahu and Ketu, you can expect to not be with them for some period of time.
Right.
But I really like this for the Virgo ascendant, that 9th house, 3rd house axis of Rahu and Ketu. The one thing that they have to be wary of is Rahu in the 9th house can be difficult when you're trying to find a guru,
Right.
even though it's exalted. So be careful of who you call your guru during this time. Now,
Right.
I mentioned this is one of the best times of education for the Virgo Lagna.
Right.
But don't call that teacher your guru. Don't put them on a pedestal. Don't kiss their feet. Don't, now it's different if your guru, your guru is a Sadguru and they're enlightened or something like that, Yogananda, Neem Karoli Baba, Amma, these different gurus that there's no questioning of them.
Right.
But
Right.
there are lots of other gurus coming out there that there's lots of questions about them.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that they're not intelligent.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that they're not wise.
Right.
But they're far from being Sat gurus.
Right.
So be careful not to think a teacher is a Sat guru, because a Sat guru is something entirely different. It's someone who's already achieved Mahasamadhi.
Right.
There are lots of wise and knowledgeable teachers out there who have yet to achieve the Mahasamadhi, and very few teachers out there that have actually achieved it.
Right.
I can only think of 4. So again, the list is very small.
Right.
So I hope everyone enjoyed Nav and I's discussion on this exalted transit of Rahu and Ketu through Taurus and Scorpio and its effect on Aries through Virgo. Then we're going to discuss in our third part Libra through Pisces, so that everyone's lugnas are addressed. But I hope this has been enjoyable for you, Nav, and I love the questions you've asked, and really excited for the third part as well.
Thank you so much, Kṣaṇāti. This was really profound and interesting. I hope everybody enjoys this video. Anybody has any questions, please write us below the comments, and we will try to address in our third part from Libra to Pisces. Thank you, Kṣaṇāti, for everything.
Thank you, Navjeet. Namaste. Om Namah Shivaya.